Good morning. Good to see you all this morning. So, firstly, let me begin with this week's parsha. This week's parsha is called Lech Lecha, which means go to you. It talks about our forefather Abraham. When he is 70, he's married to his name right now is Avram. He's married to his wife's name is Sarai, and Hashem commands Avram and Sarai that they should go to the land that he will show them, and that turns out to be the land of Canaan, which will later become the land of Israel. And Avram travels with Sarai to the land of Canaan, along with his nephew Lot, and along with their entire household, or their property, and they had servants with them. And they travel through the land of Canaan, but then they come to the land of Canaan, and there is a famine. And so they go down to Egypt. Over there in Egypt, Sarai is kidnapped by Pharaoh, and Hashem punishes Pharaoh and smites his entire household. And so Pharaoh realizes that Sarai is being punished over Sarai, and he returns Sarai to Abraham and gives Avram great gifts. And Avram comes back then from Egypt back to the land of Canaan, and then he and Lot both have a lot of livestock, and their shepherds quarrel with each other. And so Avram tells Lot, let's split from each other. You choose wherever you want to go, and I'll go in the other direction. Lot decides to go to Sodom, which was where the Dead Sea is today, before the Dead Sea died. And when it was still a freshwater lake, it was a very fertile area. Sodom was a very, very wealthy city, but it was also very wicked and very evil. We'll talk about that more in detail next week. And so Avram then moves to Lot moves to Sodom. Avram moves to Hebron, which is just west of Sodom, and over there, Hashem promises him that he will give him the land of Canaan. He will have children, even though right now they have no children, and the land that he is on, he will give to his descendants. And then there is a war where kings from Mesopotamia, from Iraq, modern-day Iraq, attack the Sodom and the Sodomite region, the entire Jordan Valley, and they destroy the city of Sodom, and they kidnap the people of Sodom. They take the people of Sodom as captives, along with Lot, Avram's nephew. Avram hears about it. Though he's only a handful of people, he chases after these 4 Mesopotamian kings, and he miraculously defeats these great kings, and he frees the people of Sodom. He frees Lot. The king of Sodom offers him money. Avram refuses to take any money or any gifts, and he says, just pay the people who came with me for their time, and that's it, and for what they spent for their costs, and that's it. And so then Avram has a vision where Hashem appears to him. He promises him that he will again have children. He will give him the promised land, and Avram asks for a sign. Hashem tells Avram they're going to make a covenant. They made a covenant he told Avram to take various animals, cut them up, and put them on, make a path with them, put the pieces on different sides, and Avram then walks through the path, which was a sign of a covenant, and they then, it's known as the covenant between the pieces, Brit Bein HaBetarim. I believe we once did a class focused on the Brit Bein HaBetarim, focused on this covenant, very important covenant in our history. And over then, Avram falls asleep, and Hashem tells him that his descendants will be slaves in a foreign land. They'll be enslaved, they'll work very hard, but then they'll leave with great wealth, and then they will return to this land, and Hashem will give them this land. And so then Avram has been now married for many years. He has no children still, Avram and Sarai. And so Sarai suggests, why don't you take a second wife? Why don't you marry my maid Hagar, an Egyptian woman? Maybe you could have a child with her. And so Avram listens, and he marries Hagar. And Hagar becomes pregnant, and she starts mistreating Sarai because of that. She feels now she's more important than Sarai, her former mistress, and former boss. And so Sarai is upset and tells Avraham, and Avraham says, you can punish her for it. She does. Hagar decides to flee. She runs away. And over there, she meets at a well, she meets an angel who tells her to return back to Avram. She will have a child. She will call Yishmael, and he will be a wild person, but he will become a great nation. And so she returns back to Avraham, and indeed they have a son, and his name, they call him Yishmael. 13 years later, when Yishmael is now 13 years old, Hashem appears to Avram. He tells him, I'm going to change your name from Avram to Avraham. And Sarai, we're going to change her name from Sarai to Sarah. Avram means the father of Aram, which is where Abraham originally came from, Aram, the land of Aram. Avraham stands for Av Hamon Goyim, the father of a multitude of nations, the father of all of humanity. Sarai means my princess. Sarah means the princess. And so their names were changed. Then Hashem tells Abraham, he's now 99 years old, that he should circumcise himself and all the people of his household, and all his descendants in future should circumcise their children at 8 days old. So Avram does not ask any questions. He immediately circumcises himself at 99 years old. And his son Yishmael at 13, and everyone else in his household. So with that, the Parsha ends. That's the story of Parshas Lech Lecha. Any questions? Yes, Ade.
Is this a part in our history where our patriarchs actually age, or is he still not aging yet?
He's definitely aging, but he lives to the ripe old age of 175.
Okay.
That's because he was a vegan.
But we don't know that he was a vegan. I'm not sure why you say that.
True.
Okay. It could have been. Yes.
Not if he raised.
Hagar was a legitimate wife to like Sarai.
Hagar was a legitimate wife to Abraham. Yes. Okay. So that's the Parsha in short. Because we did mention Egypt in the Parsha, I thought that it would be worthwhile to do a class about the story of the Jews and Egypt. I've done a number of classes about Jews from different places. I've spoken about Jews in Iran, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Morocco. I can't remember where else now, but we've covered Jews in many, many different places. They're all Sephardic. We've got to move to some Ashkenazic communities. But I figured that we should cover the Jews of Egypt as well. So Egypt was one of the first places for Jews in our history. Abraham visited Egypt with his wife Sarah when they faced the famine in Canaan. So early on they go to Egypt. Later Joseph is going to be sold as a slave and end up in Egypt, where he will become the leader of Egypt, right under number 2 to the king. Later, when Joseph meets his brothers, Jacob and the entire family go down to Egypt, where they spent over 200 years according to our tradition. They are eventually enslaved. They're not allowed to leave. And finally, until Moses comes and brings 10 plagues, and finally Pharaoh lets them go. And of course, the exodus from Egypt is the opening moment of Judaism. So although a central theme in Judaism is the exodus from Egypt, and of course we spend every year, we have a festival, Passover, with a Seder commemorating that exodus. However, Egypt is fairly close to the land of Israel, and Jews often went back to Egypt. Now, while it took Israel 40 years to travel through the desert from Egypt to the land of Canaan, the land of that which would later become the land of Israel, the promised land, however, it remains one of Israel's closest neighbors. And therefore, it was always a refuge for Jews fleeing Israel. And this, as well as Egypt, also is a very central place. It sits between the continents of Africa and Asia. And because of that, Egypt always had a large Jewish community. Now, we don't know when the community in Egypt began. There was likely communication back and forth between Jews in the land of Israel and people in Egypt. There may have been Jewish traders that settled in Egypt that we don't know. We know King Solomon married a wife from Egypt who was known as Bat Paro, Pharaoh's daughter. And later, Egypt a couple times, attacks Israel, finally conquering Israel in the days of King Yoshiyahu. This is going back in the 500s BCE, more than 2,500 years ago. So we don't know if there was still a community then, but Egypt definitely, for at least for a short period, controlled the land of Israel. However, our first actual documentation of a Jewish community in Egypt goes back to the scriptures at the end of the book of Kings and in the book of Jeremiah. It tells us how after the destruction of the first temple, a small number of Jews were allowed to stay in the land of Israel. And they were led, the general at the time, the Nebuzaradan, the Babylonian general that had captured the land of Israel and captured Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, appointed Gedaliah ben Achikam as the governor of Judea. And we did a class a few weeks ago about how Gedaliah was assassinated. And as a result, Yochanan ben Kareach, a Jewish leader, led the remaining Jews to flee to Egypt, where they settled. And Jeremiah, the prophet, along with his student Baruch ben Neriah, went along with them to Egypt. So, the Egyptian community began not long after the destruction of the first temple, which would be around the temple was destroyed in 421 BCE. We're talking about more than 2,400 years ago. And the Jewish community in Egypt was continuous from then until the mid-20th century. Unfortunately, there's almost nothing left now, but it was continuous for some 2,400 years. And this would make it one of the longest continuous Jewish communities in the world, alongside communities like Yemen and Persia, both of which we gave classes about. However, there's a big difference, because while communities in Yemen and Persia were homogeneous, they essentially had the same people. There was always some travel and some movement, but they mostly had the same people that lived there for 2,400 years. Egypt, however, the community evolved significantly over time and significantly changed. The community in Egypt faced many periods of persecution, which saw it dwindling. But on the other hand, it also had many times when large numbers of people from other places came to Egypt. So unlike the Yemenite community or the Persian Jewish community that have a very long-standing tradition of essentially the same people, mostly, who lived there for 2,400 years straight, in Egypt, it wasn't really the same people. I mean, it was a little bit of the same people, but the community keeps changing and keeps evolving. So while the book of Jeremiah tells us that after this very first community of exilees from the land of Israel settle in Egypt, they're only there for a couple years before the Babylonians attack Egypt. And there's a horrific war between Babylon and Egypt, and the Jewish community is decimated in the Babylonian-Egyptian war, with many Jews then taken as slaves back to Babylon, as captives to Babylon, like the Jews earlier in the land of Israel were. Some Jews seem to have survived and remained in Egypt, but they were now part of the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire did not last much longer, a few decades. It was soon defeated by the Persians. And under Persian rule, which now virtually all Jews, wherever they lived, whether the largest Jewish community in Babylonia, Jews in the land of Israel, Jews in Egypt, Jews in Syria or Eastern Turkey, or in Iran, wherever they may have lived, they were all within the large Persian Empire that stretched from Egypt to India. And so now Jews in Egypt were also part of this large Persian Empire. Now, fascinating, in the late 19th century, we found ancient documents in a place called Elephantine, which is an island in the southern Nile, so in southern Egypt, much further south than Cairo or the main cities in Egypt. There's an island called Elephantine that was served as a fortress, first of the Persian Empire and then of the Ptolemy Greek Egypt. And we found lots of documentation, and much of the documentation is in Hebrew or Aramaic, written by Jews who were stationed as part of Jewish mercenaries or Jewish soldiers stationed there at this fort in southern Egypt. And it tells a lot about life back then. They were in constant communication with the Persian government, with Jews in Babylonia, and of course with Jews in the land of Israel during this period. So we have some evidence then of the Jewish community then. The Persian Empire was soon conquered by Alexander, by the Greeks. The Greek Empire didn't last very long. It lasted just a couple years. Alexander died very young, in his 30s, just a couple years, just about 10 years after conquering Persia, and he had no children. And so the empire then split up among various Greek generals, each one taking a different chunk of the empire. So the general Ptolemy was stationed in Egypt, and he became the king of Egypt, beginning what was called the Ptolemy Egyptian kingdom. And so at first, he controlled the land of Israel, and the recently developed Jewish community, the newly built Second Temple that had just recently been built. And it was under Ptolemy rule that really Egypt became a center, a Greek center, a center of Greek scholarship, a center of trade. It was under Ptolemy rule that the Jewish community really grew and enlarged and became very, very successful during this time. And the Jewish Alexandria, which is up on the coast where the Nile Delta reaches the Mediterranean Sea. Alexandria was established by Ptolemy as his capital city. It was the capital of Ptolemy Egypt, and it became a very Jewish city, to the part that we're told that the city was 40% Jewish. Now, we know that at the height of the Ptolemy kingdom, the city of Alexandria was a massive metropolitan with over 1 million people, 40% of whom were Jewish. And so Jews was a very, very large community. We know it was also a very, very wealthy Jewish community. Many Jews owned lands in Egypt, which was a very fertile land, owned agricultural lands. Many Jews were involved in trade. Egypt had the distinction of being between East and West. It essentially sits between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And if you want to travel by sea from anywhere in the Mediterranean to Asia, right before they went around the southern Africa, it would be taking a boat to Egypt, getting off at Alexandria, crossing Egypt, and getting back on a boat on the Red Sea. So, and moving all your wares the same way. So Egypt became a real great center of trade during this time and had a very, very large Jewish community. Alexandria, we're told, was famous for its massive synagogue that is discussed in the Tosefta, in the Talmud. It was so large, this massive synagogue in Alexandria, that the Chazan needed to raise a flag and wave it so people would know when to answer Amen. You couldn't hear from one end of the synagogue to the other. So there's some probably exaggerations. It says that it was able to fit over 1 million people. That's probably a little far, but it was very. It means it was very, very large. Now the Greeks who ruled Egypt were a minority among native Egyptians. They saw Jews as loyal. They were not Egyptians, they were Jewish. Many Jews spoke Greek. Their primary language was Aramaic. But they saw them as loyal people they could trust. So Jews under Egyptian rule served in the military. They served in government positions. They owned large amounts of land. They were great traders. Over time, though, the Jewish community in Egypt, at least the elite of the Jewish community, the wealthy, became Hellenized. Egypt under the Ptolemies became the center of Hellenist culture, of Greek culture. It was no longer Greece. It was now Alexandria. It was the center of Greek culture. It had its famous library and its famous university. Most great Greek thinkers from that time lived in Alexandria, and many Jews were involved in that kind of Greek scholarship, Greek thought, Greek culture, and so many, at least elite Jews, became greatly Hellenized. The community remained close to Israel, although after about 150 years, the land of Israel itself was captured by the Seleucid Greeks based in southern Turkey. Eventually Israel is going to become independent, yet it's very close to Israel, and there's of course a very strong connection with the land of Israel, even once Israel is no longer politically under the same rulers. It was during this time that there was a fellow by the name of Chania, or in English, Onias, who was the son of a Kohen Gadol, of a high priest, and he was passed over the job of high priest. It was given to his brother instead. And so he came to Alexandria, and he decided to build his own temple, not in Jerusalem, but in Alexandria. Most Jews in Alexandria probably did not pay attention to it. They were loyal Jews. It's forbidden to build a competing temple. The temple can only be in the place that God chooses in Jerusalem. However, he did have followers and people that worshipped in his temple, and his descendants served as Kohanim, as priests in his temple, and they did offer sacrifices in this temple for hundreds of years until the Romans destroyed it following the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So life was pretty good for Jews in Egypt, which led to this flourishing, very large Jewish community. However, toward the end of the Ptolemy rule, the Greeks turned on Jews and began enacting many anti-Jewish laws. The Ptolemy rule was struggling, particularly with the growing Roman Empire that was threatening them, and as a result, they turned on Jews. Elsewhere, Greeks had a lot. There was a lot of competition between Greeks and Jews, particularly in the land of Israel and in Syria and other places, and so that fed into, towards the end of the Ptolemy rule, into Egypt as well, and we began to see friction between Jews and Greeks, and this led to anti-Jewish legislation and Jews being thrown out of their positions of power during this late Ptolemy period. This late Ptolemy period means right before what we call the Common Era, right before the year 0. So the Romans conquered Egypt in 47 BCE. Cleopatra was the last queen of Egypt, and the Romans conquered in 47 BCE, and they made it 17 years later, in 30 BCE, they made it a Roman province. Now the Romans saw Greeks as there was a lot of similarity between Roman and Greek culture. The Romans had adopted a lot of Greek culture, a lot of the Greek gods and religion, and so the Romans, wherever they came, and Greeks, because of the various Greek kingdoms, were spread out throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. And so wherever the Romans came, the Romans automatically made Greeks citizens of the Roman Empire. But the Romans did not like Jews. So now the Greeks in Egypt found themselves as Roman citizens. In the Roman Empire, there were citizens and non-citizens. Only Romans and Greeks generally were citizens, or elites who did maybe, had achieved various things would be rewarded, or had served in the army, would be rewarded with citizenship. Jews generally did not get citizenship. Now Jews in Egypt did not have citizenship, just like the local Coptic Egyptians also were not given citizenship. And so the Romans also had their own soldiers they didn't need. And only Romans fought. They didn't need Jewish soldiers. And so Jews who had been big in the military under Ptolemy rule no longer had a role. They also did not allow Jews to hold government jobs. They further placed limits on what jobs Jews could hold, and they placed special taxes on Jews. They were very anti-Semitic. They did this throughout the Roman Empire. It is assumed that during the years 66 to 70, when there was a rebellion in the land of Israel, leading to the destruction of Jerusalem, many, many Jews were killed. Many Jews fled the land of Israel. They would have fled all over. Some would have gone to Syria, some would have gone to Babylonia, which at the time was a different country, was in the Persian Empire, but many we assume went to Egypt as well. However, whatever influx they got, it did not last very long. In 115, the Jews of Egypt, who were very, very large in number, remember they were 40% of the city of Alexandria, which was the largest city in the country. They were very large in number. They had a history of being part of the Ptolemy military before the Romans came. The Jews in Egypt rebelled against the Romans, led a rebellion against the Romans in Egypt, at the same time as the Jews in Cyprus and the Jews in Libya all rebelled simultaneously against the Romans, what became known as the Kitos Rebellion. The Romans brutally crushed the rebellion. They killed the vast majority of Jews in Egypt, and they destroyed most of the synagogues. And yet a small number of Jews remained. There were probably hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Egypt at the time. Exact numbers we don't know. As many, we estimate, we don't have good information, as many as 90% may have been killed or enslaved as a result of this rebellion. But there were still tens of thousands left following the rebellion. The community soon grew because a couple years later, in the 130s, there was a second rebellion in the land of Israel, led by Shimon Bar Kuziba, also known as Bar Kokhba, and which led to further devastation in the land of Israel, and many Jews fled, many going to Babylonia, but many also fleeing to Egypt. So it's still a sizable Jewish community, but not close to what it was. So for the remaining Roman and later Byzantine rule, for the next 500 years or so, there remained a small but sizable Jewish community in Egypt. They suffered under Roman and Christian persecution. Like other Eastern Mediterranean communities in the Roman and later Byzantine Empire, they suffered under a lot of Christian persecution. Now, during this time, starting from around the year 200, and we've mentioned this a couple times in various classes we did on Jewish history, from around the year 200, the center of Judaism moved from Israel, where it had been throughout the Second Temple and post-Second Temple period, to Babylon. And Babylon remained at the center of Judaism, where the great yeshivas were. It was the largest and wealthiest Jewish community in the world. It remained the center of Judaism from around the year 200 until around the year 1000. For about 800 years. However, Babylon was part of the Persian Empire. Egypt was in Byzantine Rome, Christian Rome. In other words, Egypt was part of a Roman Empire that was centered around Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. And they controlled Syria, Israel, and Egypt. So the Jews in Egypt were in a different country than the Jews in Babylon. So the Jews in Egypt were more connected with the yeshiva and the religious leadership in the land of Israel, which was significantly smaller and less prominent than the religious leadership in Babylon. But the Jews in Egypt remained connected with the Jews in the land of Israel and felt themselves what would have then been called Jerusalemites. Not actually Jerusalem, no Jews lived in Jerusalem during most of this period, but Jerusalemites, meaning connected to the land of Israel, as opposed to Babylonians connected to Babylon. Any questions?
Is this like when Cleopatra? Is it like the time of Cleopatra?
Cleopatra was the last queen of Ptolemy Egypt.
Okay, so you're talking
Egypt
about
was
a little
captured
bit
in
before.
40 BC by the Romans.
'Cause
It became a Roman province. After that, through all the way until the early 600s, it was under Roman and then Byzantine rule, right? The Roman Empire shrunk, and so historians like to call the shrunken Eastern Roman Empire Byzantine. It was technically the Eastern Roman Empire. It was just this fraction of what the original Roman Empire had been.
'Cause I had seen the letter that Cleopatra wrote to Rome saying that Rome had to provide grain for the Jews because the Jews were not allowed to get
I'm not familiar
grain
with that.
from her granaries.
Okay, I'm not familiar with it.
But,
Yes.
the Greeks, you said, were disagreeing with the Jewish population just before the Romans took over. What was that disagreement?
Well, Jews and Greeks were both, I guess, educated, business-minded, somewhat urban throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. This is a time when there were lots, kind of in each area, there were, various other local groups, ethnic groups, and Jews and Greeks. And so there was a lot of friction between Jews and Greeks. Greeks had historically a long time hatred for Jews and anti-Semitism. And there was a lot of friction. In fact, a lot of the problems with the Romans in Israel was due to friction between Jews and Greeks in the land of Israel. For a long time, Jews got along with Greeks in Egypt, but towards the end of the Ptolemy rule, they struggled with them. In fact, some of the early Greek anti-Semitic works that we have, like Apion, were Greek Egyptians, right, living in Egypt.
What was their religion, the Greeks?
Oh, they had their own Greek religions, Greek gods, mythology. So around 640, the Muslims who had come out of what today is Saudi Arabia and had very, very quickly captured first Israel and Syria, and then they captured Egypt as well. And they had already captured Iraq, and they moved to the Persian Empire. Very quickly, within a couple decades, really 2-3 decades, they captured much of the Middle East. So now Egypt becomes essentially Muslim land. The Muslims built a caliphate, first centered in Damascus. Not long after, they move the center to Baghdad in Iraq. But they have this massive caliphate that eventually is going to extend from India all the way to Spain. So many Arabs settle in Egypt. Many local Egyptians and Greeks converted to Islam. So the Arabs, at this point, move the center of Egypt from Alexandria, which had always been the biggest city and the capital and this big metropolitan city. It had been one of the largest cities in the world under Ptolemy rule, and they moved it to Fustat, which would later be, Fustat is a suburb of what would later be Cairo. Eventually Fustat burns down and they rebuild a city next to it called Cairo. And that's significantly south. The reason is that the Arabs were fighting the Byzantines. The Byzantines were great, like the Romans, were rulers of the sea. They were seafarers. The Romans were great. They weren't good at fighting on land. They were great at sea. So they controlled the coasts everywhere. And so it was safest to move the center away from the coast once they moved inland to Fustat. But along with many Arabs who moved to Egypt, many Jews moved from Babylonia, which was the largest Jewish community at the time. But now it was all one big country. You could easily move around. There were new trade opportunities. Egypt is a center of trade, remember, between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. Egypt is essentially the mouth to Africa and to Europe. And there's a sizable Jewish community there. So many Jews moved to Egypt as well from Babylonia. Soon there are two Jewish communities. There is the original Jewish community known as the Jerusalemite community because they had originally been under the influence of the sages in Israel, and the new Babylonian community who were transplants from Babylonia and other parts of the Persian Empire. The Babylonian community soon greatly eclipsed and became much, much larger than the Jerusalemite community, the original community. And now, regardless, they were all connected to the central community in Babylon. Babylon became the nerve center of all Jewish communities in the Caliphate, and really by extension, all Jewish communities in the world. After the Muslim conquest. And so Egypt, both communities in Egypt would have still been connected to Babylon. Their rabbis would have studied in yeshivas in Babylon. They would all send their donations every year to support the schools in Babylon. Halachic questions they would send to Babylon. Babylon was still the nerve center of Jewish life everywhere in the Caliphate, including in Egypt. Now, it was during this time, meaning not long after the Arab conquest in the early 700s, that in Babylon, we've mentioned this when we did our class on Iraqi Jews, in Babylon, the Jewish community was led by a Reish Galuta. The Reish Gelutah, the exilarch or the king of the exile, was a descendant of the house of David, who was essentially prince of the Jews in Babylon and was the ruler, autonomous ruler of all Jews in Babylon within the Persian Empire, and that continued in the Caliphate under Arab rule as well. So there was a fellow from the family of the Reish Gelutah who was overlooked for who missed out on the opportunity to hold the position that was given to his brother. And his name was Anan ben David, and he moved on and he established a new religion called Karaim or Karaites. And they rejected many of the traditional ways of interpreting the Torah, many of the traditional ways we understand the commandments, and they evolved into their own group. It grew somewhat in Babylon itself, but in Babylon the growth was limited because Babylon was the center of the established Jewish community who fought this new group, Karaim, greatly. This was, by the way, a time, I should mention, in early Islam when Islam itself was splitting into dozens and dozens of subgroups. And the Muslims were very tolerant and they allowed for all these splits into different groups, unlike the Catholics, where everyone had to follow, the Catholic doctrine. But in the Islamic world, in the Caliphate, it was pretty free, and there were lots and lots and lots of different groups within Islam, breakaways of Islam, new religions sprouting up during this period, and so there was also this breakaway from Judaism. However, the Karaites weren't able to grow very much in Babylon, but they did come to Egypt. And they grew a lot in Egypt, which was further away from the center of the Jewish establishment. And Egypt became one of the centers of the Karaim and continued to be the center of the Karaim since those days, since the early 700s, and continued to have a small but sizable Karaite community all the way on through until modern times. In the mid-900s, there was a young, brilliant scholar from Egypt by the name of Rav Sadia ben Yosef. And at a young age, he took to fighting the Karaim in Egypt. He felt they were influencing many Jews, trying to convert them to their new Karaite religion. And so he wrote many polemics against them. And as a result, the Karaites fought him. They even threatened him. His life was in danger. And so he was forced to leave Egypt. He eventually moved to Babylon, where he became the Gaon, the leader of Babylonian Jewry, and probably, one can argue, one of the most important and most notable of all the Gaonim from the entire Gaonic period. We did a class on the Gaonim a little while back. And hopefully I'm planning to do a class on Rav Sadia Gaon separately. We'll do a class on him. Fascinating figure. So fast forward a little bit. In 969, this is again, Egypt is now ruled, part of the Caliphate, ruled by the Muslim Caliph based in Baghdad. In 969, there was a fellow called Abdullah. Abdullah was the leader of the Ismaili branch of Shiism. So there had been, although most Muslims and the caliphs, the leaders of Islam, had a particular, were what's called Sunni, but there was a breakaway early on in Islam of people that rejected the caliph and his reign, and they believed that other people should be the caliph, should be the leader, and they became known as Shias. Now the Shias themselves split multiple times over, and there are dozens of different Shia groups. So one such group were called Ismaili, and the leader of the Ismaili was a fellow called Abdullah, who was a descendant of Muhammad's daughter Fatimid, and he overthrew the governors in Egypt who were under the caliphate and declared himself the caliph, and declared Fustat as his capital, what had been the capital of the main city in Egypt. And so essentially now Egypt becomes an independent country, independent of the rest of the caliphate. He expands his rule, conquering the land of Israel, Syria, and eastward westward to Libya. Now, what they're called the Fatimid caliphs, the leaders in Egypt, were very, very tolerant and were great supporters of scholarship. And this really ushered in a 200-year of great financial prosperity and a time of great scholarship, This is, at this time, while there were, at the same time, there was scholarship in the center of the caliphate in Baghdad, in Spain, but Egypt really became one of the greatest centers of scholarship. During this time, the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which still exists, was founded, one of the oldest, if not the oldest university in the world. They argue as to which one it is, but definitely one of the oldest. And the Fatimids greatly respected Jews. And they protected them, and they removed under the caliphate, there were various, although Jews were okay within the caliphate, there were various limitations on Jews. They removed many of the limitations, and as a result, the Jewish community in Egypt really thrived at this time. At the same time, the caliphs in Baghdad, whose caliphate was really fallen apart, it had gone from this massive, massive empire to this small rump kingdom that really just controlled Iraq and the area around it. And their caliphate was falling apart. The caliphs started persecuting Jews. And as a result, many Jews from Babylon moved out away from Iraq, the largest number moving to Spain, Morocco, but a significant number also moving to Egypt. The Egyptian Fatimid caliphs appointed a Nagid, which was a leader of the Jewish community who would represent the community before the caliph, similar in some ways to the position of the Reish Gelutah, the exilarch in Babylon, essentially the leader who managed the community. Most of the Nagidim were personal friends of the caliphs. Many of them served as doctors, were doctors and were personal physicians of the caliphs. Some of them served as treasurers of the caliphs, but many of them also had a personal relationship with the caliph. In the late 12th century, the late 1100s, the Fatimids, who had been controlled Israel for some 200 years, were overthrown by Saladin. Saladin was a Sunni, and he declares himself Sultan. He was not a descendant of Muhammad, so he couldn't be Caliph, but he declares himself Sultan of Egypt. And he is also very, very tolerant, respects science, respects culture, and really continued the tolerant community. And he really allows the Jewish community in Egypt to continue flourishing. It's very large, very successful during this time. Now, at the same time, the late 12th century, second half of the 12th century, there was this while Muslims generally, life wasn't always great for Jews anywhere, but generally they were pretty tolerant. Unlike Christians in Europe, where Jews suffered a lot more, especially following the beginning of the Crusades in 1096, Jews suffered greatly in Christian Europe. In the Islamic world, they suffered somewhat. Life wasn't perfect, and there were limitations. They had to pay special taxes, and there were limits on what Jews could do, but they were mostly left alone. But in the 12th century, the second half of the 12th century, there was this crazy group of Muslims called the Almohads who rose to power in Morocco. And they demanded that everyone, Jews, Christians, remember the Muslims who had been tolerant had lots of Jews and Christians living in their lands and people of other religions. But the Almohads demanded that everyone convert to Islam or die. So many Jews, Morocco at the time had a very large Jewish community. Many Jews fled to Spain, which was very close to Morocco. Moorish Spain was also Islamic at the time. But some of them, a significant number, moved eastward to Egypt. The Almohads continued marching eastward, capturing Algeria, and then later what today is Tunis. And this led many North African Jews across North Africa to move to Egypt, which at this time, in the second half of the 12th century, is very, very tolerant. The Almohads then moved northward into Moorish Spain, which at the time held the largest Jewish community of its day. And they, again, wherever they came, they gave the Jews of Cordoba and every other place they came to the choice to convert to Islam or die. So most Jews fled to Christian northern Spain. Until then, Jews had avoided Christian northern Spain because Christians were not very tolerant. But now they had no choice, so they moved to Christian northern Spain, which leads to the growth of Christian northern Spain and the Spanish Jewish community. Eventually, the Jews will be a big part of the Reconquista as they throw the now decimated Moorish Spain, decimated by the Almohads, out of Spain over the next 200 years, and eventually, but the Jews will end up suffering a lot in Spain. But some Jews fled to other places. Some moved to Provence, which is southern France. Some moved to Italy, and a significant number moved to Egypt as well. So in Egypt now, there's a large group of North Africans that are known as Maghrabim. Maghreb is the Arab name for North Africa west of Egypt, as well as many Spanish Jews. And so now the Spanish Jews, remember, are also Moorish Spanish. They're not Spanish as we think Spanish, right? They don't speak any Spanish. They speak Arabic, right? So now they come to North Africa, to Egypt, sorry, in large numbers. And now there is, in addition to the local community made up of both former Jerusalemite and Babylonian communities, which have by now merged. Right, those communities were in the 600s. This is now the late 1100s, 500 years later. They're now merged. They're known as Mista'arvim. While the new community are called Maghrabim. Maghrabim meaning from Maghreb, from Western North Africa. And then the Spanish Jews become known as, which in Hebrew was always called Sfarad, the Spanish Jews become known as Sfardim. So there's now really three major Jewish communities in Egypt. The original Mista'arvim, the Maghrabim from North Africa, and the Sfardim from Sfarad, from Spain. Not Spanish as we would think it today, but Moorish Spain. These are Arabic-speaking Spanish, Sephardic Jews. So now, of course, the most notable Sephardi who left Egypt fled Spain and came to Egypt during this time was the Rambam, Maimonides. He was quickly recognized as the greatest Torah scholar, not just in Egypt, but really in the entire world in his day. And his very presence in Egypt turned Egypt into one of the most important Torah centers during while the Rambam was there. The Rambam becomes the personal physician of Saladin, the king of Spain, of Egypt at the time, and he is appointed both as the rabbi of the community as well as the Nagid, which essentially would be the president of the Jewish community. And for the next 150 years, that the Rambam was so important to Egyptian Jews that the Rambam's descendants continued to serve in those two roles as chief rabbi and president. They don't usually go together, right? Usually either the rabbi or the president, but they served as both rabbi and president of the Egyptian Jewish communities for the next 150 years, the Rambam's descendants. Any questions?
The Ramban, his son is the Ramban.
No. The Ramban is Rav Moshe ben Nachman, who lived in Girona, Spain. In Aragon, actually, at the time. Not related, not connected at all. Ramban stands for Rav Moshe ben Nachman, and Rambam stands for Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. The Rambam had one son. His son's name was Rabbi Avraham ben Harambam. He's known as Avraham, the son of the Rambam. So by the mid-13th century, this is the mid-1200s, not long after, right, a new group comes to power. Saladin's family don't stay in power, are known as the Abuyads. They stay in power for less than a century. And by the mid-1200s, there's already a new group, a group of Turkish fighters, Turkish soldiers, who had originally been hired as mercenaries. They overthrow the king, and they establish themselves as rulers of Egypt. They're known as Mamelukes. So the Mamelukes then control Egypt and the area around it, including Israel, Syria, for the next 300 years. However, unlike the Fatimids and the Abuyads, who had been very, very tolerant, open to scholarship, open to trade, had good laws, good law and order, very tolerant of different groups, Christians, which Egypt still had a sizable Christian community from the Coptic Christian community. They're very tolerant of Jews. The Mamelukes did not care for any of that. They didn't care for learning. They didn't care for culture. They didn't believe in the rule of law. They didn't believe in trade. And they certainly had no tolerance, especially for Jews. This led to a decline in Egypt. Financial decline, loss of rule of law, loss of free trade leads to financial decline. It led to a decline in the Jewish community because there was, first, life was tough financially and was no longer thriving, and there was a lot of persecution among Jews. Jews were forbidden from holding public office, although they had widely done so for the previous few hundred years. They had to wear yellow cloths on their turbans, something that we found in Christian Europe as a sign that they were Jewish. Many synagogues were shut down. Jews were forbidden from many different types of work Jews were not allowed to do. They had a whole list of things that Jews were not allowed to do. And finally, about 100 years later, in the 1370s, Rav David HaNagid, the descendant of Maimonides, who was still the leader of the Jews in Egypt, was forced to flee Egypt for Aleppo and left Egypt, the last descendant of the Rambam, to lead Egypt. So by the late 1300s, the Jewish community in Egypt had really dwindled. It continued. There was still a sizable community, but it was much, much smaller than it had been in the time of Egypt's Hide, or the time of its golden years under the Fatimid and later Abu Yad dynasties. But under the Mamluks, it really, really suffered and dwindled. It was still sizable, didn't disappear, but it was much smaller. Many Jews went to other lands to try their fortune or to find their freedom. In 1517, the Ottomans conquered Egypt. The Ottomans were Turks who had originally started in Anatolia, had made their way, modern-day Eastern Turkey, had made their way to, had conquered Constantinople, and eventually moved into Greece and into Europe, and then they moved south and conquered Israel and Iraq, and eventually in 1517 they captured Egypt. Now, this is right after the Spanish expulsion in 1492. And Spanish exilees are looking for places to settle. And many Spanish exilees, in fact, most Spanish exilees settled across the Ottoman Empire, spread out throughout the Ottoman Empire, in Greece, in Turkey, in the Balkans, in Syria, in Israel, in Iraq, and significant number of Sephardic Jews, Spanish exiles, now settle in the land in Egypt. This is different from the original. They had previously there had been three communities of the Mitarvim, the locals, the Maghrabim, the North Africans, and the Sfaradim. But these are all Arabic-speaking communities. Now there's a new Ladino-speaking Spanish Jewish community from Christian Spain that settles in Egypt. And very quickly, and they build their own community, their own Sephardic community, and very quickly this community becomes the largest and most dominant community in Egypt. They outnumber the locals by far. And this is really a time, once again, where the Egyptian Jewish community grows and becomes very, very large. During this time, Egypt produced many great scholars, had great yeshivas from scholars from Spanish origin. There's many Spanish Jews who were great scholars, and they brought their Torah studies and their yeshivas with them. Perhaps the most notable, and who was widely recognized as the chief rabbi of Egypt, although he didn't hold an official position, was Rabbi David ben Zimra, known as the Radvaz. Also at this time, following the Ottoman conquest, there were many Ashkenazic Jews who were fleeing Germany, where Jews were persecuted, most of whom went to Poland at the time, but some headed south to the Ottoman Empire. And small Ashkenazic communities popped up in Constantinople and throughout the Ottoman Empire. And at this time, there was a small Ashkenazic community began in Egypt. Most notable of these Ashkenazic Jews was Rabbi Bezalel Ashkenazi, who became known for his work, the Shita Mekubetzet, and he became known for his work. Also notable Notable half Sephardic and Ashkenazic was the Arizal. The Arizal was Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, probably the most important Kabbalist in all of Jewish history, and his father was an Ashkenazi with the name Luria, which is a common Ashkenazi name, and his mother was Sephardic. His mother was an Egyptian Sephardic, was originally from Spain, but her parents had settled in Egypt, and the Arizal himself grew up in Egypt, was raised there. Eventually, of course, he moves to Tzfat, where he becomes famous as a great Kabbalist.
That's why so many Sephardim have the last name Ashkenazi.
Because they started as Ashkenazi, yes. In the 17th and 18th centuries, life got for Jews throughout the Ottoman Empire got much harder. The Ottoman Empire had a golden period throughout the 16th century, but then the Ottoman Empire essentially started to dwindle. And the central government was very, very large, and the central government did not have much power over what was happening in the provinces. And so local pashas, they were called beys, local leaders, often had control and did whatever they wanted. And the leadership in Constantinople had very little power to change it. And this led to a lot of persecution of Jews in various different communities throughout the Ottoman Empire, especially further away from the center in Western Turkey and Greece. And so life in Egypt, as a result, got much harder as well. The local beys, the local governors were not very supportive of the Jewish community, not very open, a lot of limitations on the Jewish community. In 1805, there was an army officer who seized control of Egypt. His name was Muhammad Ali in a coup, and he declared himself governor of Egypt within the Ottoman Empire, but he forcibly seized control of Egypt. Still nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but for all practical purposes, it was autonomous. The Ottomans didn't recognize him at first. He fought wars against the Ottomans. He even threatened to capture the Ottoman Empire at one time, till the Ottomans called in the Europeans for help. But eventually they made peace, and he was recognized as a governor of Egypt. Egypt nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but for all practical purposes, it's now independent. Under his leadership in the 19th century and subsequent leaders, his children, his son, his grandson became kings. Egypt then began to modernize. And this especially happened in the late 19th century with the building of the Suez Canal. With the building of the Suez Canal, European powers, first France, then France couldn't afford it anymore and called in England, and so later the British stationed troops there, and essentially Egypt became a protectorate of the British. And during this time, Egypt thrived as a center of trade, especially around the Suez Canal, where a lot of trade was going through, and many Jews moved to Egypt, both from other parts of the Ottoman Empire, as well as from Eastern Europe, reestablishing the Ashkenazi community in Israel. By the early 20th century, there was a sizable Ashkenazi community in Egypt. Jews were, at this time in the late 19th, early 20th century, tradesmen, business leaders, doctors, held important positions, and they had large organized communities. Jews in Egypt were almost entirely urban. They lived almost exclusively in Cairo and Alexandria, small communities in a few other cities, but the Jewish community was fairly successful, fairly wealthy, fairly organized. The Jewish community also was quite Zionistic, supported the land of Israel. Many Jews moved to the land of Israel. However, as the possibility of creating an independent Jewish state became more realistic, and as the Arabs began to fight back against a Jewish state, the Egyptian rulers also banned Zionism, banned support for the Jewish state, and this really reached a climax in 1948, when 1947, when after the UN vote, when Israel was going to become a state on its own, there were many attacks against the Jewish community throughout the Muslim world, but including in Egypt. So most Jews, as a result, over the coming 2 years, between 1948 and 1950, majority of Jews fled and moved to Israel. Most Jews in Egypt did not have citizenship. They did not offer Egyptian Jews citizenships. The Jews that did have citizenship were not allowed to leave, but some Jews had gotten citizenship because they were elites, but most Jews did not have citizenship and were allowed to leave. The vast majority of the community left. There was still a sizable community after 1950. The most had left. It's estimated that in 1948 there were between 60 and 80,000 Jews living in Egypt, and definitely more than half of them, if not more than that, left in those 2 years. But there were still many Jews in Egypt. In 1954, the Israeli government came up with a very foolish plan, known in Israeli history as the Haparsha Hamabish, the foolish plan, because it's one of the most foolish things the state of Israel ever did. They decided, in order to try to get the British not to leave the Suez Canal, they decided to hire Jews in Egypt to commit terror attacks against Egyptians. And the group of Jews that were involved were quickly caught, and many other Jews, because Egyptians hated Jews in general, were arrested as a result. And it led to a really harsh treatment for the Jewish community in Egypt. Some of them were killed, and it made life very, very difficult for Jews in Egypt. In 1956, Israel, the Egyptians seized the Suez Canal from the British and French and blocked Israeli ships from the Eilat port. And so Israel captured all the Sinai, all the way down to the Suez Canal in 1956, what was known as the Sinai Campaign. Following the Sinai Campaign, many Jews were arrested and placed in camps. After some time, finally, the Egyptians relented and allowed the Jews in the camps to be taken out of Egypt, and they were brought out of Egypt, mostly to Europe. Following the Six-Day War, many more Jews, of the remaining Jews, remember it's really dwindling, were arrested again and were held for years. And most of those Jews who were imprisoned after the Six-Day War, remember Egypt lost the Six-Day War, so they let it out on their own Jews. Many of those who were in prison were later released in prisoner exchanges following the Yom Kippur War. There were large prisoner exchanges. Many Israelis were captured in the early days of the war, and so many of all the Jewish prisoners were released then. By 1970, there were less than 1,000 Jews left in Egypt. Today, there's at most a handful. Very, very few Jews left in Egypt. Unfortunately, that Jewish community that was around for 2,400 years is now gone. However, there is a very large Jewish community around the world today. The descendants of Egyptian Jews are estimated to number about 200,000 people. About half of them live in Israel. There's a very sizable number here in the United States, and the rest live elsewhere, wherever Jews live, South America, Europe, and other countries as well. So that's really the story of a storied history of the Egyptian Jewish community, which really had its ups and downs, was not consistent, really went up and down over the years, but remained strong for 2,400 years until it finally really came to an end in the last few decades. So just before we conclude, I just want to mention, firstly, we have this coming Wednesday, we will be starting a class on relationships. Relationships are central to our life with our family, friends, acquaintances, co-workers. You got to build relationships in life. Unfortunately, we don't always know how, or we don't always do it as good as we should. And so we have a lot of Jewish tips on how to build relationships. We're going to do a 6-week class on our Jewish traditions, on how to build successful relationships, how to enhance good relationships and build better ones. So that starts this Wednesday. Some of you I know already registered. If you have not yet done so, you still can. And then on Thursday, we have a fellow called Shabbos Kestenbaum, who is a graduate of Harvard. He was at Harvard last year, and he was a